It's what we call trigonometry, and it's only to do with right angled triangles. That's a really good point to note. If you see a right angled triangle, it's either Pythagoras or it is trigonometry. Now, the way you can tell whether it's Pythagoras or trigonometry is because there is an angle involved. So we're going to use it to find sides using the angle, and in a minute we're going to have a look at finding some angles as well. So the first and most important thing to do is understand how to label the sides. So if there's the angle, let's say that's 60. Opposite the angle, this side here, always opposite, is called the opposite. And the longer side, which is opposite the right angle, is always the hypotenuse. Now I find those two the easiest to find, and therefore that is the adjacent. So if my angle is here, I don't need to put a number. This is the opposite, this is the longer side, and therefore the other one is the adjacent. Now, when we orientate a triangle like this, the hypotenuse is always a little bit tricky. A lot of people go for this one, but opposite the right angle is always the hypotenuse. Wherever the other angle is, opposite that is the opposite, and therefore the other one is the adjacent. And the other thing you need to know for trigonometry is this: so, ka, toa. Where S, C and T stand for, just make sure you can see this, the sine, cosine and tangent buttons on your calculator, and the O's, the A's and the H's of what I've just explained there. Right, so you have to work out which of these trigonometric ratios you're going to need for each question. Then you just type the numbers in basically, and we're done. So let's have a look at this one. Let's zoom in a tad. So here we have the opposite and the hypotenuse in the question. You can see the adjacent we're not asked to find, and we're not told any information on it, so it's not involved. So I like to write my SOHCAHTOA out every time. And you can see the one with the O and the H is the SO. So that's the one we're going to be using. And if you draw a line here, it tells you the formula basically. So it's the sine of the angle is the opposite divided by hypotenuse, O over H. With that line, it just helps me remember its division. So then you've got your formula, you just pop the numbers in. So the angle was 40, opposite was x, the hypotenuse was 9. Now all I have to do is get x on its own. At the moment it's being divided by 9, so if I times by 9 to both sides, I will get this. And now it's simply a matter of typing it straight into your calculator, and you should get an answer of, to 2 decimal places, of 5.79 centimeters, of course. Now let's do the same for this one. I'm going to just put a line there to separate it. So we do the same again. We've got the opposite there, the hypotenuse there, and the adjacent. So the opposite's got nothing to do with it. So if I write my SOHCAHTOA, it's the A and the H, so it's this one. So C stands for the cosine button on my calculator of the angle. Adjacent, it over hypotenuse, all from the formula. C equals A over H. Pop the numbers in. So theta, the angle, is 60. The adjacent was x, and the hypotenuse was 11. And you can see we've ended up with a very similar situation here. So to get rid of the divide by 11, I must times by 11. And again, just type that into your calculator, and I get 5.5. So this was 5.5 centimeters. Now, if you've seen my YouTube video to Bruno Mars on this, it says when x is on the top, times is what you do. So when x was on the top, we did times. Now the next bit says when x is on the bottom, you pull the switcheroo. Now, I've explained mathematically why this works many times in my other videos. For this, it's a revision video. It's just getting you up to scratch, basically. So let's show you what it does. So opposite and adjacent. So this one is the tan. So tan of the angle is the opposite over adjacent. Pop the numbers in. Tan of 49 is the opposite, and this time the x is on the bottom. So what I mean by the switcheroo is you can literally swap these two over. So it's 8 over tan 49. Now you just type that in. 8 divided by tan 49, 6.95. So you'll only end up with either it looking like this, with x is on the top and then times is what you do, or if x is on the bottom, you pull the switcheroo. So opposite and hypotenuse, I know this one is the sine. So sine of the angle is O over h. Pop the numbers in. So 35 is 6 over x. X is on the bottom, we pull the switcheroo. So the x and the sine 35 swap over. And then we just type it in. 6 divided by sine 35. And I get 10.46. It is worth making a note that this, we're trying to find the hypotenuse, so it must be longer. It's worth checking. Here, this might not be drawn to scale, so you might get an answer bigger than 8, but normally it says not drawn to scale, so you can't measure it, but it's relatively realistic. So that's less than 8. So it's looking good. So please use a bit of common sense. Now, when we go to find angles, in my song, I say this. I'll just zoom out so you can see it all. Now all that's left to learn is how to use the inverse. Then there's some other words. Then it tells you to press shift on your calculator. So when we find angles, we have to remember to press shift on our calculator, and that's called using the inverse. So opposite, hypotenuse, adjacent. The opposite is not being used, so it's the A and the H. I'll write it again on this page because we don't have it. So, ca, tawa. Draw my line. So, it's ca. So, cos of the angle is A over h. Pop the numbers in. So this time the angle is x, A is 8, and the hypotenuse is 10. Now what I prefer to do here is actually type this bit into my calculator, or if it's like this you don't need to, you can just work it out for yourself, which is 0.8. Now to find the angle, we need to get x on its own, so we need to remove this cos. To remove something, you always do the inverse, and the inverse of cos is when you press shift cos, and you'll see it appear like that on your screen. Now I use this button, the A and S button, which is next to the equals on every calculator, and what that will simply do is remember your previous answer. So press answer and then equals, it remembers what was on there. So if I put, well, this one's quite easy, but I'll put 0.8 in, then I'll do shift cos of my answer, and I will get 36.9 to 1 decimal place. So x is 36.9 degrees to 1 decimal place. Now if we do this one as well, we've got the opposite and the adjacent, so it has to be tan. So tan of the angle is opposite over adjacent. Pop the numbers in. So the angle is x, the opposite was 9, and the adjacent is 5. Now again, you should be able to work that out quite simple. That's 1.8, so tan of x is 1.8. Just check my maths, yeah. Now again, we need to remove tan, so we're going to use the inverse of tan. And one of the reasons I worked this out is because sometimes this number can be really, really long and irrational. So it's good to just do it and then use your answer button. So I'm going to do the tan minus 1 of 1.8. And if it goes on for longer, I just put a few dots. And when I type that in, so shift tan of my answer, I get 60.9 degrees to 1